I got sent an email from a King County Sheriff's Office employee that was sent out by Sheriff Patty Cole-Tyndall. And it raises alarm bells for a lot of reasons, but the gist of the email that she sent out to her staff is that she is working closely with lawmakers in Olympia to raise your property taxes. Yes, this is the sheriff, the appointed sheriff of King County, who is sending her employees an email assuring them that she is working closely with lawmakers in Olympia to raise your property taxes. Does that sound weird to you? Yeah, it sounded weird to me too. I want to read the entirety of her email for you so you have it in context before we discuss, I guess, why she's doing this. It says, as most of you know, we're working on in a tighter budget environment. We were given a directive to drastically reduce our spending for the 2026-2027 budget cycle. Final budget adjustments continue to be discussed. All King County agencies supported by the general fund have a similar directive to decrease expenditures. I realize this may sound challenging and at times insurmountable. Please know we are working diligently to minimize the effects of this to employees, and at this time we do not anticipate any reductions in staffing. I will be working with our leadership team to do everything we can to mitigate impacts on the King County Sheriff's Office and the communities we serve. All of that up to this point, just fine. I would expect her to do no less. It says emergency response and calls for service remain our top priority, and we are doing everything we can to help ensure the impact to public safety is as minimal as possible. We are working closely with state legislators on efforts to lift the 1% property tax cap. If successful, this will help increase the general fund, which in turn will help support how we as an agency are funded. As we navigate our way through this, you have my promise to share any updated information as soon as possible. We will get through this together. So there it is, that we are working closely with state legislators on efforts to lift the 1% property tax cap. So as you know, because we've discussed on this show, in fact, this bill is on my list of the top 10 bad bills working their way through Olympia this legislative session. It is House Bill 1334. That is the bill being pushed by Democrats that would allow counties, local jurisdictions to raise your property taxes by up to 3% at a time without asking voters for approval. That's the key here. So right now, and this goes back to an initiative that was passed by voters in 2001. In 2001, voters in this state decided that they wanted to limit property tax increases that could be passed without voters deciding, without it going to voters, to 1%. So it's a 1% cap. So if you're King County Executive Dow Constantine, you could raise property taxes by up to 1% at a time without having to ask voters for approval. So what Democrats in Olympia want to do is they want to change that from 1% to 3%. So now you could have King County Executive Dow Constantine or some other county, and they could say, all right, we're going to increase your property taxes by 3%, and we don't even have to ask your permission. So they want to change what voters via initiative put into place in 2001, because of course they don't care about what voters have to say. They don't care about the initiative process. We've talked a lot about that. We're also going to talk about it more on the show today. So not a surprise that Democrats are doing this. It's been something that jurisdictions like King County have wanted to do for some time. But the fact that the sheriff of King County, who, as you know, went from being an elected position to an appointed position. And we said all along what the problem with that was. One, it's insane that the voters of King County voted away their right to vote for the sheriff. That is just insane. And it shows the amount of disinformation that was being pushed at the time around race and social justice, and this lie that voters were sold that, oh, if a politician appoints the sheriff, they'll be much more accountable than if voters vote on the sheriff. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. But this is the exact thing that we were worried about. It's the exact thing we were warned about. Because now you have the sheriff who is personally advocating, working with Democrats to raise your property taxes. And look, I think Patty Cole-Tyndall can probably think for herself. I'm not saying that she can't think for herself. But I am questioning who is urging her to work with lawmakers on this and who's actually pulling her strings. Because who is the one politician in the entire state of Washington who has advocated for raising the property tax levy lid more than any other politician? Who is it? It's Patty Cole Tyndall's boss, King County Executive Dow Constantine. Going back several years now, he has warned of, this was back in 2023, October of 2023. Dow Constantine warns of dramatic fiscal situation if cap on property taxes doesn't change. And he was laying out, we covered it on the show at the time, I remember it very well, he was laying out all these dramatic cuts they would have to make to really important things if Olympia did not give him the power to raise your property taxes at a higher rate without asking your permission. And I think that's key here, is if Patty Cole Tyndall, if the sheriff's office really needs money, like they're going to have to fire sheriff's deputies or lay them off, their response to 911 calls is going to hurt. They can ask you for a raise in the property taxes. They just have to put it on the ballot. Nothing about the property tax levy lid in this state precludes them, as you well know, from putting a ballot measure on for you to vote on it. And I'll tell you, in King County, voters are very generous with their tax money. They're very generous when it comes to agreeing to increase property taxes. They do it all the time. So there is nothing that would stop Dow Constantine, Sheriff Patty Cole Tyndall from going to voters and saying, look, we're in a dramatic fiscal situation because we can't manage our money at all. And it risks cuts to the sheriff's office or a lack of 911 response. I guarantee the voters of King County would approve it. Guaranteed. But they don't want to have to go through that. They want to, on a whim, whenever they want to raise your property taxes by 3%, and they don't want to have to bother asking you. Because they want to be able to do that whenever they have anything that they desire to fund, even if it's not something as important as public safety. And I would point out, at the time in 2023, when Dow Constantine was raising alarm bells, we're in a dire fiscal situation unless Olympia does something and lets us raise people's property taxes by more than 1% at a time. I couldn't help but notice at the exact same time, there was an article in the Center Square about King County actually putting together to go to voters an increase in property taxes. And what did they want to fund at the time? King County moves on potential $1 billion property tax hike for climate action. It's because that's the shit that Dow Constantine thinks is important. That's the stuff when he says we're in a dramatic fiscal situation, that's the kind of stuff he worries they won't be able to pay for. So he wants to be able to raise your property taxes by 3% per pop to pay for things like climate action. And in order to do that, he has now his puppet, the sheriff, an appointed position, to be able to go to Olympia and advocate to lawmakers to raise your property taxes so they can fund climate action and all the other nonsense, wasted programs that Dow Constantine has pushed during his many, many years in office. And look, as I said, when I think about, and I've never really heard anything bad about Sheriff Tyndall in terms of her as a person. So do I know or do I think that Sheriff Tyndall might support a raise in property taxes on her own, absent this position? Sure. I mean, that's possible. But when you really think about it, would she in her position, appointed by Dow Constantine, would she oppose something that he supports? Ask yourself that. Dow Constantine has pushed for years to increase property taxes and to have Olympia do that and give him the power to do that without a vote of the people. So do you think that Sheriff Patty Cole Tyndall, who now serves at his pleasure, would oppose that idea? Would ever feel empowered to go against her boss? Of course not. Of course not. And that is the issue with having an elected sheriff as opposed to an appointed sheriff. It is not a coincidence that it's the King County Sheriff who's painting this dire picture, working behind the scenes with lawmakers to raise your property taxes, and that it's her boss who, more than any other politician in the state, has advocated for just such a policy. So again, we warned about it several years ago when voters made the decision to vote away their right to vote for a sheriff. And now all those warnings have come to fruition. You basically have a sheriff who should be focused on public safety, serving people, and yes, even advocating, God forbid, if you had an elected sheriff who could go to Dow Constantine and say, hey, You're spending all this money on climate action, all this money on DEI, all this money on your failed homelessness response. So you go cut stuff from there before you come to the sheriff's office seeking cuts, before you cut our ability to respond to life or death emergencies. If you had an elected sheriff, they would be empowered to do that. And our old sheriffs would have. They would have told Dow Constantine to go you-know-what himself. But she can never do that because he could decide just like that she's not the sheriff anymore. And so now she has to do his bidding in Olympia. And his bidding is raising your property taxes. Don't say we didn't warn you.